All right, let's take a quick look at this curriculum continuum. And we have on we have two axes on this. And so you can think of this as like graphing something. We can measure something along this axis, and we can measure something along this axis to see how they intersect. And so let's look at this horizontal here, which is looking at the nature of how curriculum is organized for students. So we have traditional separate subjects. Obviously, in secondary schools, this is happening pretty much almost exclusively. And then in many elementary schools, as low as first, second grade, we have their day being divided out into separate subjects. Parallel disciplines would be when you combine just two disciplines together around something, but you still teach them separately. So you might have students reading some historical fiction in a literature class and studying that time period in a social studies class. So it's happening parallel, being taught separately, different assessments, different assignments, but there's hopefully a connection that they see between the two things. Multidisciplinary is the same, except now we're bringing in more disciplines. So now if we add in into that, looking at a time period, now we're looking at scientists from that time period to bring in some science content or the big discoveries of that time period. So we've added a third discipline there, still in a separate bubble, but around a central idea or thing. Interdisciplinary, then there starts to be a blurring, or there is a blurring between the subject areas. And so instead of we're studying a time period, we're looking at the science of it, we're looking at the literature of it, we're looking at the political history of it. The students start to lose the lines between the things. So they're not seeing it as, okay, I have an hour of science and we're going to look at this science, and then I have an hour of social studies and we're going to look at this social studies, and they have their separate assignments, their separate assessments taught by different people. So interdisciplinary can be often team taught as you bring people together, or in an elementary classroom, you don't have the separate lenses through which you're looking at that time period or that subject or that thing, and so the assessments can kind of double dip, if you will. You might have students writing and evaluate the writing for its technical writing skills and conducting some experimentation and presenting that, what they find in their technical writing. And in so doing that, they have to read some content to apply to that experiment, and they do all three of those skills and subjects to bring it together into one final assessment or assignment that's brought together. Ephemeral integrated unit. This is when you have separate subjects being taught either at the secondary or the middle school or the elementary, and then for a time period you stop doing all the separate subjects and you do just one integrated unit around a theme or an idea or a topic, and you don't worry about the different disciplines. You just are focusing on that concept or that thing or that time period, and students are doing things that are related to that, and not worrying at all about what subject it is, even though probably all the subjects might be represented there. It's ephemeral, meaning that it's for a short period of time. Those teachers come together for 2 weeks to study the Olympics while the Olympics are happening, and then at the end of that 2 weeks, they all go their separate ways and back to their classrooms and continue on their normal curriculum. And then transdisciplinary, this is more of a permanent situation where the students are studying things, doing tasks, doing large projects possibly, and in doing that, they are having to use all the different skills of different disciplines and learn the content of different disciplines, but there's no artificial lines drawn between them. Everything is focused on that authentic task or product that's happening, or that study of a phenomenon, and then all aspects of it without having to suss out what is the social studies and the science and language arts and so forth. One of the Scandinavian countries, I believe Norway or Finland, is working towards making their K-12 curriculum completely transdisciplinary, no subjects anywhere. It's all about studying things and happenings, and in so doing, studying all the content that they feel is essential. You can imagine it takes a huge amount of planning on the part of the teachers to make sure that everything gets covered, but in a way that is connected to this authentic task that students are doing. Okay, now let's look at this other axis, and this is not the way the curriculum is organized, but now what the content of the curriculum is and what it's it's organized around. So the bottom we have random craptastic. You can imagine what that means. That is, from the student's perspective, it is random. I don't know why I'm doing it. From one day to the next, it seems to just kind of go together, and I don't know what we're doing or why we're doing it. And then we have thing-adic, and thing-adic are often interdisciplinary. They don't have to be, but the majority of what you have taught or experienced fits into thing-adic. A unit on fractions, that's about a thing in math. A unit on cells, that's about a thing in biology. A unit on presidents, that's about a thing in U.S. history. Now, how broad you study each of those things is why we'd have a scale here. A very narrow focus on it would be narrow thing-adic, and a broader focus where you might start to get some interdisciplinary connections between the U.S. presidents. And so you're studying history, and maybe you are reading some biographies and studying how biographies are written. And so now we are starting to see some interdisciplinary connection. So you can see that the broader thing-adic can also then move along this scale here. In fact, all these can move along this scale. Now let's move on to the thematic. And thematic, the difference between thing-adic and thematic is thing-adic tends to be around a thing, an event, a person, something like that. Thematic is around a conceptual theme that might involve things, but it's got a broader look at that thing. So, for example, we could study presidents, and we could study fairly broadly, or we could study the concept, what does it mean to be a good leader? And in so doing, we could study presidents, but we could also study CEOs, or coaches, or teachers, or something like that. And so now we've moved to a conceptual theme. So now they are taking aspects of what makes a good president and maybe looking at that, and then also looking at, well, do those same personality traits apply to being a good CEO or a good coach? And so you can see that we're getting into some critical thinking. The more abstract the theme, then the more critical thinking has to happen to make those connections and take what you learn about one thing and apply it to another thing. And there's no hard lines between these here. So we could study about types of currency, and we could move it up to studying about ways that we value things in our society, and even further on abstract to what does it mean to value something. And so you can think of all kinds of examples within disciplines. We could look at cells, or we could look at how things grow and develop. That's getting still a little bit thing-adic, but now you're starting to add in the idea of change. And so we could have a theme about change. And the other thing you can notice with these is, while they seem complex, they often are complex to some degree. Doesn't mean you can only do these with high school students. Elementary students can study change, and they can look at how they see change happening in plants and in their body and in when ice melts. I mean, very simple change. You could keep repeating that theme of change every year and then get into biological change, and then looking at concepts of how do things change, what are change agents, what causes change, and get into more conceptual of what happens to make change happen and get into systems thinking and positive and negative feedback loops. And so you get into more conceptual things up here. So as we continue now, when you map out what you're doing, if you map out what your lessons and you realize, okay, they're all separate subjects and that's the way it's going to be, that's the way it has to be. Let's see, when I look at what I have from day to day to day to day, it's really just a series of fun activities, but I don't know why we're doing them. Now we're down here in this bottom quadrant. We don't want to be down here. You want to work your way at least up this direction so that it's around something meaningful. Most traditional secondary schools then are going to be obviously traditional separate subjects, and hopefully they're not random craptastic, but they're getting up into conceptual themes possibly. So thematic units in a traditional secondary school might be up here. You are at least, even if you're stuck in your silo, you are still requiring some conceptual thinking within that discipline. So ideas of change within chemistry, for example, or matter and energy cycling in biological systems as opposed to just learning about cells and photosynthesis. In this quadrant down here, we can have very interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, but it's random craptastic in the sense that the students don't really know what the purpose is, why we're doing it, how do things connect together. As you move up this scale here, and eventually if you're looking up into this area, whether you are over in here or if you are over in here, which might be the ultimate here, you get, the further up you go and the further to the right you go, it's more potentially stimulating and rigorous because now you are asking to make connections between things and find patterns. Obviously that's where we want our children to get to, is so that they can solve problems and find patterns and see connections. And the other thing you'll notice as you look at these ideas, the more you get up this scale, the more authentic things seem to be. If I'm moving up this scale, now I'm having them solve problems around an idea, and the end result is something that is more applicable, as opposed to just learning about a thing. But now we are having to learn the skills around that thing, and I can apply it to other disciplines now. That's more authentic. As you get more interdisciplinary, that's more authentic, especially if you can get conceptual and interdisciplinary, because that's the world we live in. We live in a world that is interdisciplinary. So then you can have students doing authentic tasks, solving real-world problems, and making connections that are about bigger ideas. And that's where we want to get our kids to, because that's the world that they live in.